here, but what I would like to speak about today is one of the questions I've been interested in, also as part of our work with teachers, which is part of the project you've heard about, is how we help teachers to become more effective thinking teachers. But we have not only teachers here, so I will try to address this question a little bit broader. Because when we speak about the question of development of thinking, we're speaking not only about teachers who help learners to develop thinkers, we also speak about parents and grandparents who help their children and grandchildren to do it in the family context. And we also speak about educational management that can organize the process better to facilitate the process. So these are the three things and three strands of this conference. And I would like to reflect on this experience, so the experience of introducing the framework, which you can see, and the framework was the basis for our work with teachers and parents. And if I summarize it very briefly, what we basically spoke about, that in order to help teachers to make a step towards more thinking in the classroom, we have to organize work with tasks through three steps. We have to get teachers to work more with challenges, to challenge learners, and this is more or less a thing in teaching thinking movements people agree on. We have to get people to, or to get students or children we work with, we need to get them to develop strategies so that instead of giving them strategy, they build strategies. And then we need to get them to reflect on the process of building a strategy, introducing a strategy, and finding limitations of that strategies. And this has been basically the framework of our work with teachers. And on the basis of that, we also have a definition of a thinking task, which we use in the context of the thinking approach. And this is the approach to the development of thinking, which we've been developing with colleagues. And this thinking task, as we define it for the purposes of the project, has actually three main characteristics. So this is a task where the immediate answer is not known to the learners. This is the first thing. The second thing, which is extremely important, the strategy for getting to an answer is not known to the learner, because otherwise they can just follow the strategy. And the third characteristic, that ways of doing a task or strategies is one of very important outcomes. And we also agreed largely with teachers and parents we've been working with that the question is not so much about whether a task is a thinking task or not a thinking task. The question is very often is what we do with the task, how we organize the learning activity with children or grandchildren or students so that we can help them to become better thinkers. So there are some teachers who are more successful when they start working with the thinking approach, and some teachers who are less successful. Some teachers, and this is probably a general characteristic of any approach to the development of thinking, there are a number of teachers who drop out on the way. So why does it happen? So why do we lose some teachers with whom we start working? Why are some parents really keen on teaching their children to think better, while others basically stop the moment they realize that they need to make an effort in order to move in that direction? So why are some head teachers really supportive of their teachers who are trying to bring about a change, and some are not? Why are we, as teacher educators, are very enthusiastic about some of the colleagues we're working with and less enthusiastic about others? Because, okay, let's be open. We also are people and we have our, preferences. And sometimes we're more enthusiastic, sometimes we're less. But why? So these are some of the questions which I've been thinking about. And I think that a partial answer to some of them, at least an answer that could help us maybe understand the answers to this question better, is the question of competences. So which competences are necessary for teachers or parents or educational managers in order to organize the process effectively? So this is the question which I would like to speak about today. This is more like a suggestion and more an attempt to provoke a constructive dialogue and maybe some future collaboration, rather than to give you a comprehensive picture of anything. I think that's a very important thing to say. In my view, the big picture I would like to propose to you, to speak about it, I would like to divide those competencies which we need for education for thinking into 3 large groups. And one group, or maybe core group, would actually have nothing to do with competencies for teaching thinking or competencies for teaching in general. This is something which I called metadispositions. It's basically our view of the world, certain philosophical principles we share or don't share. And all of us have this, and some of the differences that can be described between us is also according to what we see and how we see and how we treat certain things. And these things, in my view, are very important actually to more or less success of a person in teaching thinking. The second part of it is what I call general teacher competencies. So these are not competencies specifically associated for teaching thinking, but these are general competencies which are important for teaching effectively, whether we teach in school, whether we teach at home. So probably a better way would be saying competencies for organizing learning. And only the last group would be specific teaching competencies for thinking. What I would like to draw your attention to, that when we speak about competencies, it's very important to remember about these 3 constituent parts. So we speak about knowledge, we speak about skills, and we speak about disposition. So all these 3 aspects, whether we speak about general teacher competencies or specific competencies for teaching thinking. Okay, metadispositions. What am I speaking about? What I'm speaking about these metadispositions. So the first thing which I find very important is dispositions towards being comfortable with uncertainty. And if I can give you an example, to what extent or how many teachers do we have who can feel comfortable in the classroom when they offer their learners a task they don't have an answer to, or they don't even know how to get to the answer? Because traditionally in the classroom, irrespective, by the way, of the methods of teaching, teacher still knows the answer. When the teacher does not know the answer, he or she feels much less comfortable, and this makes it more difficult for his or her to organize what I refer to as teaching for thinking. Another disposition which I find very important is something which I call disposition towards evidence-based approach. In education, as in anything else actually, there are fashionable things. There are things we do because everybody does them, and it's customary to do them. Not very often we actually have the evidence for that. And I think that we have lots of examples now. I think a fashionable, or not a fashionable, at least a well-known resource where you have lots of examples for that is Hattie's book on evidence-based learning, where there are many examples where certain things we believe are important, according to research, are not actually that important. Another thing, I guess, which is very well known is praising learners. Lots of teachers believe that praising learners is a good thing. There is lots of research in the context of mindfulness approach, for example, that it leads to opposite results, in fact. So it's not just about praising, it's about many other aspects of praising. So this wish to actually have evidence for whatever we believe in is very important. Another is a disposition towards what I call constructive approach. And here I'm not speaking about constructivist tradition. I'm speaking more about certain view that is helpful. It's like, when we speak about development of thinking skills or creativity, we can divide creativity and thinking skills in many different ways. And when we go to sources, we can find lots of different definitions. But some definitions, whether they are right or wrong, this is secondary, are more constructive. I mean, they're more useful to help us become better teachers or to organize the learning process more effectively. And some definitions are just less useful. So, and I think as teachers it's very important that we actually tend to support those models which can actually help to organize the process better. Another thing is a disposition towards certain level of specificity. You know, again, we tend to speak very often in the field of education in a very general way. Like, certain things become popular, like, for instance, the idea of a portfolio some time ago became popular. But when you talk to the average classroom teacher, to what extent this person can actually explain in a specific, clear way the difference between a portfolio and a notebook? And to what extent they actually see the difference between a portfolio and a notebook? Because if they don't, there is no point. I mean, it doesn't help in any way. Another important disposition is disposition towards seeing limitations of whatever we do. Because again, there are things which are generally good. But if they're generally good, it does not necessarily mean that they're always good. Are questions from learners always good? Are discussions always good? I'm not sure. There are lots of contexts when they're not good and definitely not useful for certain pedagogical aims which you have. And it's very important, no matter how wonderful something is, to see the limitation. Is it always good to develop thinking skills of learners? No, I don't think so. There are certain contexts where it's probably not the best idea. And this is disposition towards seeing limitations. Another important disposition is disposition towards seeing everything in a systematic way, in a systemic way. So again, there are certain changes in education which we support and which we think are very positive changes. But if we try to look at it in a systemic way, we can see that there are obvious problems which we have to address if we actually introduce this change. Because changing one element necessarily causes changes of many other elements. For example, if we have a classroom where everyone is working with a tablet, which is reality in a number of schools and will be a reality in a number of other schools, lots of things about learning process change, dramatically change, and also lots of things about teacher competencies. Because the question of evaluation and assessment changes completely if everyone has a tablet. Because you just need to change very often the procedure for evaluation and assessment. Do we actually evaluate it? Do we change the process of teacher education having this in mind and knowing that this will happen? Another disposition is disposition towards seeing everything in development. To what extent we not only know, but remember when we take decisions or when we plan something, that things are changing. But when we speak about disposition, the question is how much we are inclined to find these data when we believe in certain things and have a certain judgment. So another I think, this important disposition is disposition towards noticing and defining contradictions. Do we actually see that in certain decision-making situations there is a problem and there are two contradictory requirements, and we have to keep both in mind when we take a decision? For example, if we forbid children to play video games as much as they want, it obviously has not only pluses but also minuses. And if we introduce the same tablets to the classroom, it obviously has not only pluses but also minuses. And it's very important to think about problems and look at these problems and try to address them. And of course, a very important pragmatic question from the point of view of organizing teacher education. How do we assess this? Because if we are responsible for this, if we want to develop this, then we should also be able to assess it. So the question of assessment of dispositions, I think, is one of the questions we should be interested in as teacher educators, and especially teacher educators for thinking. We speak about several important things. So one thing is how we see learning. As teachers or as educators, we can see learning in many different ways. Yes, we can see, and I try to put some binary oppositions which show us the difference. Yes, we may believe that when we organize the learning process, they should take or they should build. We can see that it's important for the learning to be easy or it's important for it to be challenging. We can see learning as linear or non-linear. We can see learning as more being knowledge-based or competence-based, and a number of other differences. But we can describe differences between ourselves by comparing our vision of learning. And certain vision of learning is more useful for the context of teaching thinking, while certain vision of learning is less useful. Another thing is teaching. We all, if we are involved in the educational process, we all have a certain view of teaching, don't we? We can see teaching as being about giving or being about scaffolding, is being more about input or being more about output. If it's more about giving certain tasks and asking our learners to do, or it's more about contextualizing it. So is it more about the approach from aims, what we want them to learn, or from resources? This is the textbook we have. And again, I think what's important when we speak about the real world is not to speak about idealistic view. In the ideal world, we all know what is better. But when we look in the real classroom, what is actually happening? Do teachers start from the aim? Or do many of them start from resources? Do many of teachers think about output at least as much as they think about input, etc., etc.? I think that these questions are important, and they are about general teacher competences. Content of learning, of course, is a very important question, and I think that as teachers, especially today, I as a teacher can feel responsible only for my subject or also for more general competences. And if more general, then which competences, the development of which competences am I responsible for? Because if my main responsibility is my discipline and competences related to my discipline, then who is actually developing creativity, thinking, and all these things? Because if no one is taking the responsibility, then most probably no one is developing. Again, the organization of the process can be very different. So you can think about your course or your lesson in terms of what you ask your learners to do or what you have to cover, and there is a difference. You can think about learning dialogue and artificial dialogue. You can speak about time you spent on something and, for example, how much you can learn during this time which you've spent on something. Materials. I think that the major difference here would be whether we see materials as an aim or materials as a means. So, very often we teach a textbook. Or maybe we don't, but they do. So very often. And if they do, and if there are many of them, then something is to be changed about it. And of course, evaluation and assessment. Again, there can be very different view about evaluation and assessment. Who is responsible, whether criteria should be known in advance or they should be developed on the way. If the purpose of assessment is to improve or actually to see where we are. If we do it in the end or we do it all the time, and all those things. Okay, these are the things, as I said, which I think you know. And again, there is a question of assessment. How do we assess this when we work with teachers? And the last group, which is actually fairly short, you might be surprised, but I think there are very few specific dispositions which are important when we speak about teaching thinking. And one of them, which is very important, to what extent we are able and we want to problematize the content, to create challenges for our learners. So to what extent actually we can distinguish between just asking them to make a presentation or getting them to make a presentation in order to change the audience's opinion. There is a huge difference about it, and in any task we can actually problematize it so that it's not easy to do up front, and then there is a challenge to learners. To what extent are we able to contextualize, or as I call it, sell challenges? So basically, to what extent learners accept the challenges which we bring to them? Because one thing is to bring a challenge, and the other thing is to get them to accept it. And I think one of the core advantages of games-based learning is that they're very good at this. They're very good at selling challenges. So learners accept them and they want actually to be challenged. And this is something we're not always very successful with in the classroom. Lots of examples. Take the mother tongue. Learning punctuation in the mother tongue. Is it very motivating for most learners who study mother tongue in their countries? So there are lots of examples like that. So we are not very good at selling this. to the learners, but we should be if we want to develop their thinking skills. Another very important competence is our ability to actually formalize or write strategies. So we, as teachers who develop somebody's thinking, we should be able to formalize things. Test and find limitations. So if we get them to develop models and build strategies, we should be able to test and find limitations of this. And there are lots of examples when we forget about limitations. And being a former language teacher, I can give you some examples from the English language, which are kind of classical things. It's like in many English as a foreign language classroom, teachers teach that there are verbs in English that are not used in continuous, which is not true. But it's still being taught in many contexts around the world. Or there are contexts where you teach things like, you use some in affirmative sentences and any in interrogative and negative sentences. And this is not true again, because if you start testing it through the corpus, you will see it does not work. But it's still being taught. So are we able actually to find limitations to whatever we are teaching? Reflection on strategy and its development. So I think that reflection now is very popular in teaching and learning. So we all agree that we have to ask our learners to reflect. But reflect on what? So because one thing is to reflect on the process and the outcomes, and this is very important. But another thing is reflection on the strategy and how we develop the strategy. And this is also a very important part if we actually want to develop thinking skills of learners. And the last part, so the last disposition, is planning and responding with questions, actually. And this is very important for any teacher, I think, who wants to develop thinking skills. So one of the challenges when we worked with teachers, one of the things many teachers said was the most difficult is not to give an answer when students ask you. But the moment you give an answer when they ask you, you kill any room for thinking. There is nothing to think about if you actually provided an answer. Okay, so these are mainly the things I wanted to share. And as I said, I haven't tried, and I'm not interested in giving you a comprehensive answer. What I'm interested in is a dialogue. And when having this dialogue, there are several questions which I'm interested in discussing, when you have time after this session, during the breaks, or during the open forum tomorrow. And I'm happy also to add some more questions to this list. So I'm interested in your opinion of the big picture itself and the division. So scope and clarity, something very important from your experience, because we have many very experienced people here who've worked a lot with teachers. And I would be very much interested in having your perspective. What is to be added? What else is very important? What changes actually if we speak about the competence approach in teacher education? Assessment. So how do we assess? Because if we speak about it in a pragmatic way, if we want to improve the quality of teacher education, we should be able to monitor and assess what we are doing. What are your experiences? What is effective in terms of assessment in teacher education? And implications. So if you see any and how you see them.